What's up everyone, Tech Mindset here. In today's video, we're doing a side-by-side between HDR and non-HDR footage. Quick upfront disclaimer, be sure to watch this video in HDR. If you're catching this video soon after it was posted, give YouTube a day or so to process the HDR. In my smaller tests, it was available to watch in HDR the day after I posted it, but who knows, it might take longer to process this since this is a much longer video, so keep that in mind. In my previous comparison video, I had set up a camera in the room with the same settings capturing both HDR on and HDR off and displaying the results side by side. Even though it was not recording in HDR, it was still possible to see a difference between HDR on and HDR off. Having owned this monitor and seeing other YouTubers talk about HDR, I can agree that it's hard to show the difference without seeing it in person. So I thought to myself, if I can record gameplay footage in HDR, maybe I could make a comparison video. Well, that went on the back burner until recently when I happened to stumble across a video on YouTube that talked about how to record HDR footage with OBS, and I was stunned. I hadn't used OBS in a while, and when I did, I didn't have time to update it because I was usually in the middle of something else. After running an update and following the instructions, I was now able to record HDR in OBS. Before I go any further, I thought I'd share the settings I used in case you wanted to try it. Keep in mind though that I have a Ryzen 5900X CPU and an NVIDIA RTX 3080, so there may be differences depending on your hardware. Another important note, the files you capture with these settings will be very large. In addition, it's one thing to record the clip in HDR, but a workflow to be able to edit and export HDR content is another beast entirely. Here are the steps in OBS that I'm using. First, make sure that your OBS is up to date. Before you go further, it's probably best to save a profile with your current settings so you can have a backup in case you need to go back and reference it later. Go to Settings, go to Advanced. In the video section, change color format to P010. Change the color space to Rec 2100 PQ. I don't think I changed the other settings, so I'll just show what they look like just in case they're different on your end. Next, go to the Output section and go to the Recording tab. In the recording settings, change encoder to NVIDIA NVENC HEVC. I think AMD has a different one for theirs, but for NVIDIA, this is what I use. I left recording format as MP4, but beware that if OBS freezes or crashes, that could mess up your file. I've already lost a couple clips I was recording while making this video because OBS locked up when I was recording. For the encoder settings, I have rate control set to CQP, CQ level to 20. Next, it's very important that profile is set to main 10. I'll show the other settings on my screen, but again, I don't remember if I had changed these. Next, I created a scene and added game capture source. Next, go into the settings for the game capture source and see my settings. The color space is set to Rec 2100 PQ. Back to the topic of profiles, I found that it was best to set an HDR and a non-HDR profile so I can go back and forth as needed. However, just note that the settings for the gameplay capture source do not get changed when you change your profile. You have to manually go into the game capture settings and change the color space from Rec 2100 to sRGB or whatever it was before when you want to capture HDR and non-HDR footage. I had to kick myself a few times during the making of this video because I would change the profile, but then I forgot to change the game capture source color profile. Whoops. With all that out of the way, you can see when I use media info, this video clip recorded in OBS is showing HDR format. Okay, now I can record MP4 files that have HDR with OBS. But what if I wanted to show some of the same PS5 games that I showed in my last comparison video? It actually turns out I had the capability to do that the whole time. Enter the EVGA XR1 Pro capture card. I had picked up one of these to see if I could record HDMI out from a computer for doing tutorials in prior videos. Looking up the specs, it turns out that yeah, it actually supports HDR. However, it looks like it only supports 1080p in OBS while doing HDR unless I'm doing something wrong. Now for the hard part. As I said before, capturing HDR footage in OBS is one thing, but actually taking the footage, editing it, and then exporting a finished video is a whole different beast. Taking this footage into an editing software is much more complicated. I edited this video with DaVinci Resolve, and I only just scratched the surface of what you can do with it. On top of that, while I have a beautiful monitor in my Alienware QD-OLED panel, it's not a proper monitor for doing grading and color work, not to mention all the other different variables of screen and lighting wherever you're watching this video from. Check out my review of my Alienware QD-OLED panel for more information about my monitor. I also purchased the studio version of DaVinci Resolve to be able to export the final clip for this video, so be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with others to get the word out. I recently hit 200 subscribers, and we're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, and I need your help to achieve that goal. So with that in mind, I should also add a disclaimer that this comparison video is for entertainment purposes and should not be seen as a lab test, since I don't have the proper reference monitor and Blackmagic hardware to output to that monitor. I had to make about a bazillion test clips, fiddling and tweaking with various settings with the goal of getting the exported clip as close as I can get to the original HDR on and off clips that were encoded with OBS. Maybe there's extra fiddling around I can do, but just know that there's going to be a bit of a difference between the original clips from OBS and how close I can get to the finished product out of DaVinci Resolve. Regardless, I can say that with my eyeballs as my witness, the end result will get the idea across of what HDR on and off will look like. Last chance, be sure you're watching on an HDR capable display and that YouTube is displaying the video in HDR. First up is Uncharted 4. I really enjoyed this level for the amount of details they put in, as well as the cinematic action. When it comes to HDR, the fire effects and the overturned car really pop for me and I can see more detail. Next up is Horizon Zero Dawn. This one is a good example with the amount of saturation that is present without HDR. With HDR on, the colors feel more natural. Next up is Battlefield 1. Battlefield 1 has some extra contrast added with HDR. Next up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. This one looks great in HDR with the fire and explosions, and when I'm in spots with bright light and dark environments, it pops much more with HDR on. Next up is Final Fantasy VII Remake. Similar to Horizon Zero Dawn, in addition to the extra pop of the light sources in HDR, the color of this scene is also more saturated without HDR on. The sparks from the attacks and the glow of the enemies as they dissolve look gorgeous. Next up is God of War Ragnarok. Same as always, the contrast looks great. Kratos pops much more in the fire and the snowstorm outside is brighter coming into the cave. Next is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. It's a great contrast between bright and dark areas. Next is The Last of Us Part 2. The extra bright sunlight hitting the snow looks good. The graphics in this game are just great. Next up is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The benchmark shows a great scene at nighttime with the bright lights. This scene was also used to show off ray traced shadows when the RTX 2080 first came out. I happened to record an example with RTX on and noticed the shadow on Laura's shoulder looks so much more natural with RTX on versus RTX off, but that's a comparison for another video. If you'd like to see that, be sure to leave a comment below. Next is Star Wars Squadrons, another game that looks great in HDR, with bright light sources and beautiful backgrounds that really pop on my monitor. Next up is Battlefield 2042. Similar to other examples, the light sources have that extra punch. Finally, Spider-Man Miles Morales. I just love coming back to this scene in HDR. It looks so amazing on my OLED panel. So all in all, even if it was very tedious to put together, I had a lot of fun doing this because whenever I was drooling over a monitor and hearing about HDR, I would have no idea how much HDR would actually enhance the image or not. And going to a computer store and seeing that monitor on display, I'd just be looking at a Windows desktop and I couldn't play any games on it. I hope that with your TV or smartphone, you can see the difference between HDR on and off, and you can get an idea of what it looks like and if that's something that you might be interested in for your next monitor. If you have ideas for future videos that you'd like to see, be sure to leave a comment below. That's all for this one, and I'll catch you in the next one. Later.